Hey guys, Sean from SGT Report here. My friend author James Perloff recently gave a powerful and important presentation in Watertown, Massachusetts. It's called War and Deception. Now guys, as you know, James Perloff has authored some must-read red pill books, including Truth is a Lonely Warrior, Shadows of Power, 3 Pieces of the Jigsaw, which we recently did an interview about, and of course, The Case Against Darwin, which led to my most watched interview ever, titled The Elite Don't Want You to Know God is Real, which was in large part about that book. James has asked me to consider doing something I've rarely ever done before. He's asked me if I might upload his entire War and Deception presentation. James wrote to me saying, I do believe it would be a keeper, one that, like God is Real, people will keep on watching because its relevance won't fade. And James also says, I do believe that with Bolton pressing for war with Iran, the last on the list of Wesley Clark's famous 7 countries, it is more crucial than ever for Americans to understand how they've been deceived into wars. Friends, I hope you'll watch and share this video with your family, especially kids, teenagers, and young adults who have been taught fables about the real history of our world since birth. And as you watch War and Deception, consider the deck that is stacked against our president, Donald J. Trump. Consider the fact that our president now has James Comey, John Brennan, and other deep state coup conspirators on the ropes. And also consider the fact that the DOJ under Donald J. Trump has launched antitrust investigations against Google, Apple, and even Amazon. The deck has been stacked since before any of us was born. And though it's unlikely that any one man can bring it all down, our president certainly appears to be trying and winning. This presentation is brought to you in part by my good friends at Organica Naturals, which specializes in a specific product, an oil, which cannot be named on YouTube without retribution from the thought police. But suffice it to say, it's a product that can help alleviate anxiety, restore health, and some parents even report using it successfully to help recover children suffering from autism. The ad for this specific product and company is proudly featured on sgtreport.com, thelibertymill.com, and thephaser.com. So you can click through there, and if you use the coupon code SGTReport, you can save 15% off your entire order. I'll also leave the link which you can click below this video. Now, without further ado, and for the historical record, James Perloff's War and Deception.
How many of you folks saw the movie The Matrix? Well, you might remember that in The Matrix, the hero, Neo, he learns that the world he lives in is an artificial reality. And he's given a choice. He can either take the blue pill or he can take the red pill. If he takes the blue pill, he can go on believing in this artificial reality, but if he takes the red pill, he can wake up and find out what's going on, even though that will be upsetting for him. And I know some of us here can relate to that. Today's presentation will be a little bit like taking the red pill. By the way, do you guys know that even though The Matrix was made in 1999, Neo's passport expires on September the 11th, 2001? But repeat after me now, everyone. It's just a coincidence. Okay, great. So my talk today is going to be on war and deception. I believe that before we embark on this, we first need to throw out some basic concepts. Because if America has been repeatedly deceived into war, it implies some kind of continuity within our government, something that goes beyond just the Democrat and Republican parties. So I want to start out by throwing out 6 concepts that will make the orchestration of these wars a little bit easier to understand. If these concepts are new to you, I don't ask you to accept them, just keep them in mind as possibilities as we go through today's talk. The first is that America really is not a democratic society. In reality, we're ruled by an oligarchy. Back in the 60s, we used to call it the establishment. Today, we often hear it referred to as the 1% or the deep state. I'm sure many of you have heard that term. And I have a book here. It's called America's 60 Families by Ferdinand Lundberg, published in 1937. And Lundberg was a very distinguished financial journalist. He worked for the Wall Street Journal, New York Herald Tribune, UPI, and here's what he wrote in his book, America's 60 Families. The United States is owned and dominated today by a hierarchy of its 60 richest families. These families are the living center of the modern industrial oligarchy, which dominates the United States, functioning discreetly under a democratic form of government, behind which a de facto government, a real government, right, absolutist and plutocratic, has gradually taken form. This de facto government is actually the government of the United States, informal, invisible, shadowy. It is the government of money and a dollar democracy. I just want to point out something here. Ferdinand Lundberg was not a conspiracy theorist. He simply looked at the financial records and he proved that these 60 families essentially owned America. It doesn't mean they owned every mom and pop store, but they owned all the major industries. In fact, this is recently backed up by a study from Princeton that the US is an oligarchy. Do the oligarchs control the government? We've got rich people, they control the industry, they control the politicians, and of course, if you're rich enough to control industry, you're rich enough to buy politicians. And Ferdinand Lundberg, in his own time, documented that they were hand-picking presidential candidates before the presidential conventions even took place, the nominating conventions. That's held true whether it was a Democrat like Woodrow Wilson or a Republican like Herbert Hoover. I wrote a book in 1988 called The Shadows of Power. You might wonder how the oligarch connects to the sitting administration, and they do it by supplying cabinet-level personnel through the Council on Foreign Relations. This book has sold over 100,000. It's still in print today. Council on Foreign Relations, CFR for short, is the main nexus between the oligarchy and the government. Just to give you some numbers to back this up, since the council was founded in 1921, it's produced 21 secretaries of defense, which used to be called the War Department, 19 Treasury secretaries, 18 secretaries of state, and 16 CIA directors. Bear in mind, this is not a big group. I mean, when Kennedy was president, they only had 900 members. They're up to about 5,000 today. Concept number 2, the oligarchy seeks a world government. In other words, a single government, ultimately, eventually, to rule the whole world. This man here is Admiral Chester Ward, the former judge advocate of the U.S. Navy, and he was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations for 16 years before he resigned in disgust. And here's what he said. He said, the Council's objective is submergence of U.S. sovereignty into an all-powerful one world government. This lust to surrender the sovereignty and independence of the United States is pervasive throughout most of the membership. Now, we could document this through extensive quotes from many people. The Council was formed in 1921 as a direct reaction to the U.S. Senate's rejecting America entering the League of Nations, which is the first attempt at a world government. Concept number 3, the oligarchy isn't just American, it's international in scope. Lundberg just looked at the American records, but the Council on Foreign Relations has counterpart organizations all across the globe. In England, for example, it's the Royal Institute of International Affairs. And how do these groups interact? Well, through groups like the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderberg Group, and upper levels of Freemasonry. I stress upper levels. If you look at the EU, it's actually a microcosm of world government. It's a stepping stone, countries gradually surrendering their sovereignty to a central authority in Brussels. And as a matter of fact, Zbigniew Brzezinski, big figure in the Council on Foreign Relations, who was advisor to presidents from Carter through Obama, said this, quote, "We cannot leap into world government in one quick step. The precondition for genuine globalization is progressive regionalization." In other words, you can't get to world government all at once. You've got to build it up from the bottom. And as a matter of fact, NAFTA was designed to emulate the European Union. The European Union started with a common market, evolved into the EU. NAFTA is supposed to evolve into a North American Union, and they've actually tried to do that already, but thanks to people in Congress like Ron Paul, it hasn't happened yet. Concept number 4. Jerusalem is to be the capital of the world government. Now, you might have noticed a lot of activity occurring recently regarding Jerusalem. For example, Trump recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. We're moving our embassy there. And actually, former Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann, you can see this on YouTube, she sent a video message to the voters of Brazil telling them only to vote for a presidential candidate who would support moving Brazil's embassy to Jerusalem. So this is actually a pretty big deal. In fact, the first prime minister of Israel was David Ben-Gurion, and he made a prediction about the future in Look magazine, 1962. He said, quote, "All other continents will become united in a world alliance at whose disposal will be an international police force." That's a world government, right? "All armies will be abolished and there will be no more wars. In Jerusalem, the United Nations, a truly united nations, will build a shrine of the prophets to serve the federated union of all continents. This will be the seat of the Supreme Court of mankind to settle all controversies among the federated continents." Again, these are concepts I'm just throwing out. to help understand our discussion of wars. I'm not asking you to accept them. Then this next one, I almost left it out, but I think it's important to include. Almost left it out because it may be too hard for some people to accept. But researchers say at the uppermost levels, many of the oligarchs are Satanists, Luciferians. Not saying all of them, but many of them. Now, who says this? Well, you can go back through the history of journalism. William Guy Carr, who worked for Canadian intelligence, wrote 3 books about this in the 1950s. The most famous was Pawns in the Game. Ted Gunderson, 29-year veteran of the FBI, whose last position actually was the special agent in charge of the Los Angeles office with 700 FBI personnel underneath him. You can see his interviews right on YouTube. Also, Dr. John Coleman, former officer in MI6, that is the British CIA. You can see his many books, white papers, and his presentations on YouTube as well. And recently, this man has caught a lot of attention. Ronald Bernard, one of Europe's top bankers, a Dutch currency manipulator. He broke with the oligarchs after he was actually asked to engage in satanic ritual child sacrifice. Several interviews with him on YouTube. This is too hard to swallow. Another thing you can take a look at is there's video from a hidden camera of the Bohemian Grove ceremony, which take place every year in California. And figures from America, from Bill Clinton to Dick Cheney to Bechtel executives, have taken part of this. And they actually take part in front of this tall owl in a mock human sacrifice. Some people say it's not really mock. But if Luciferian is too much for people to accept, well, let's just put it this way. They're not the nicest guys on the block, and they don't stay awake at night worrying about what's good for America or your best interests. Finally, concept number 6. The oligarchy controls the press. Now, in Lundberg's book, he has a chapter called The Press of the Plutocracy. Remember, this is 1937. Now, he went from coast to coast, and he demonstrated that the 60 families actually owned every newspaper chain with the exception of Howard Scripps, and they owned most of the major city newspapers. And today, it's much worse. Today, we have 6 corporations to control over 90% of all media. If you watch TV or pick up any kind of print journal that's mainstream, it's owned by one of these 6. For example, Time Warner not only owns Time Magazine and Warner Brothers, they own CNN, Money Magazine, People Magazine, Sports Illustrated, Fortune Magazine, HBO, TNT, Cartoon Network. It just goes on and on. If you're watching sports on ESPN, that's Disney, they own it. If you're watching ABC, that's Disney, they own Lifetime, A&E, the History Channel. Now, of course, they own the rights to Star Wars, right? And if you're watching Fox News, that is News Corp, which also owns the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, London Sunday Times, hundreds of print journals. I mentioned Fox News. They also own Barron's. If you read Christian books printed by Zondervan, they own that too. What this means is that media is centrally controlled because these 6 corporations, their directors communicate with each other. They interlock in organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations. And that means you get a uniform reality from your TV set. And that's how they create the matrix. In other words, mainstream media is centrally controlled. Now, for people who don't believe that, let's just watch this clip. Note that these news anchors, these local news anchors, are from various networks, Fox, ABC, CBS.
Hi, I'm Fox San Antonio's Jessica Headley.
And I'm Ryan Wolf.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our
Treasure Valley communities,
The El Paso, Las Cruces communities,
Eastern Iowa communities,
Mid-Michigan communities.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But
we are concerned about trouble and trying to irresponsible, one-sided news stories plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and false
news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these stories simply aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 Well, I think I saw something in that clip that is definitely dangerous to our democracy. On to the main topic, which is war and deception. I'm actually going to start with the Spanish-American War, 1898, and I know that some people may think, well, how boring, who cares what happened more than 100 years ago? There's a couple of reasons we're going to start with that. One is that if we don't understand history, we're doomed to repeat it. And the other reason is that by showing the pattern of events through history, we can confirm the fact that America is indeed run by the same oligarchy, because there's a consistent pattern. It's not just Democratic administrations alternating with Republicans. Now, we're talking about the media, right? Now, back in 1898, there was no internet, there was no radio or television, and people got their news from newspapers, and the kingpin of the newspaper world in those days was William Randolph Hearst, whose name became synonymous with yellow journalism, which means dishonest journalism. And his paper, the New York Journal, had the largest circulation in America. New York Times was really nothing back then. His chief competitor was Joseph Pulitzer's New York World, but both men had a common objective, which was to get America into a war with Spain over Spain's colony, Cuba. Hearst began fabricating stories about atrocities that the Spaniards were allegedly committing in Cuba. For example, he said that the Spaniards were roasting Cuban priests. And here's some actual headlines from those days. Cubans fed to sharks, cries heard at night, they're taken outside the harbor, and the silent ferryman comes back alone. Butchered 300 Cuban women, defenseless prisoners shot down by Spanish soldiers. Raided a hospital, more than 40 sick and wounded Cubans butchered. Well, these stories were all fake. In fact, there was no hospital at all in the area that the New York World was describing. Then, on January the 24th, 1898, the White House decided to send the battleship Maine into Havana Harbor, Cuba. Now, no minutes of that meeting were kept, and the very next day, January the 25th, the Maine sailed into Havana Harbor, and the Spanish were not even notified. And it just sat there for 3 weeks. It was doing no good. I mean, there was no American interest at that time in America to protect. And then this happened. This is the Spanish ambassador to America, Enrique Dupuy de Lome, and William Randolph Hearst paid bribes to have his private correspondence stolen. And in this correspondence, he found a letter critical of President McKinley, the president at that time. And the letter said that McKinley was a low politician who catered to the jingos of his policy, jingo meaning a war hawk. It was printed in Hearst newspaper under this headline, "The worst insult to the United States in its history." This was a violation of diplomatic immunity, by the way, to publish private correspondence. But this headline drove anti-Spanish feelings to fever pitch. And then 2 days later, the USS Maine exploded. 266 men lost their lives, and that's all that was left of the ship. Now, a U.S. Naval Court of Inquiry could not find any information that linked the sinking of the Maine to the Spaniards. In fact, Spanish sailors were diving into the water to save American survivors who were taken care of by Spanish doctors and nurses. But the yellow press had no reservations. Check these headlines out. Crisis at hand, Spanish treachery, Spanish plot. And Americans were subjected to propaganda pictures like this one. Look at this guy. He's pictured as a Spanish brute. He's half man, half ape, right? And he's got his bloody hand on the grave of the Maine. And look at his feet. It's trampling the American flag as if to say, come down here and fight me, and you, Cuba, you Americans, I challenge you, right? But would Spain have actually sunk the Maine? Actually, Spain had tried desperately to avoid war. They caved in to demand after demand. You know, we said, you got to get rid of your Governor Weyler, and they did that. And for a land war in Cuba, their troops would have to come 4,000 miles, but Cuba's only about 100 miles off our coast. But most importantly, Spain had an old navy. It was mostly wooden. They didn't have the firepower of our navy, which was increasingly steel. This is Admiral Pascual Cervera, who commanded Spain's Atlantic Squadron, and he warned his government of, quote, our lack of everything that is necessary for a naval war, such as supplies, ammunition, coal, provisions, etc. We have nothing at all. Now, this is borne out by two naval battles during the Spanish-American War, one in Manila Bay and one at Santiago, Cuba. We destroyed both their squadrons. At Manila, we destroyed their Pacific squadron, and at the Battle of Santiago, we destroyed their Caribbean squadron. totally. And in those battles, we lost no ships. In fact, we only had one casualty in each battle, and one of those was from a heart attack. So why did Spain fight? You know, that's a good question, right? The reason they fought was this. The U.S. government gave them an ultimatum: you have to leave Cuba, evacuate it. Spain had ruled Cuba since 1511, almost 400 years. And everybody in Spain, whether they're liberal or conservative, thought that Cuba was part of Spain, just like we think Hawaii or Alaska is part of America. If they had caved into the U.S. demand, they would have faced a revolution at home. And so given a choice between revolution at home or a war we can't hope to win, we better fight the war with honor. And so that's what they did. But why did the American oligarchy want this war with Spain? Well, there are at least 6 reasons, and I won't go into them all. But I'll give you one that's pretty easy to understand. Cuba, by the 19th century, had become the wealthiest colony in the world and was the world's largest sugar producer. Back in those days, sugar was considered very valuable. It was called white gold, just like the Rockefellers would call their oil black gold. But to get a war going, you got to control the president, right? Now, William McKinley was from Ohio, which is the home of Standard Oil, which is why it's no coincidence that we've had more presidents from Ohio than any other state. Now, when he was governor of Ohio, McKinley went bankrupt and was bailed out by a group of businessmen led by this man, Mark Hanna, who was friends with John D. Rockefeller. They'd, in fact, been high school classmates, and Hanna was the front man for Rockefeller. After the bailout, he became McKinley's political manager and his handler. In fact, when McKinley went to the White House, he actually invited Hanna to live right in the White House, although Hanna took up residence very close. Here's a political cartoon of the two. Critics called the President McHanna. National City Bank was controlled by the Rockefellers in those days. By the way, it's still around. We just call it Citibank. Okay, that's what it is. After the war, they took over the Cuban sugar industry. Quoting Lundberg, quote, National City Bank during McKinley's incumbency was more significantly involved in administration affairs than any other bank. National City Bank benefited most directly from the war. For Cuba, the Philippines, and indeed all of Latin America soon afterward became dotted with National City branches, and the Cuban sugar industry gravitated into National City's hands, end quote. And here's an actual magazine ad from National City Bank boasting of its Cuban sugar holdings. By the way, Lundberg mentioned the Philippines, right? I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but the way we got the Philippines and Guam and Puerto Rico, we took them spoils of war after this 4-month one-sided war against the Spaniards. That's how we got there. All right, well, moving on to one that a lot of people don't remember, and that's the invasion of Veracruz in 1914. We actually made war on Mexico that year. The U.S. Marines invaded Veracruz, the Mexican port, occupied the city, and killed 129 Mexican soldiers. So what was really going on here? Well, we'll give you the blue pill and the red pill. Here's the blue pill. In 1914, some American sailors landed in the Mexican port of Tampico, and they broke the city's port rules, and so they were arrested. Well, within 24 hours, they returned to their ship totally unharmed. But the American commander down there, Vice Admiral Henry Mayo, insisted that the government of Mexico formally apologize for arresting his soldiers, and he demanded that they fire a 21-gun salute to the American flag. Well, the Mexicans said, look, if you want, we'll apologize, but we are not going to fire a 21-gun salute to your flag. We have not done anything that merits such an act of subservience. Now, this went up to the presidents of both nations, Woodrow Wilson and Victoriano Huerta. Wilson demanded that the salute be fired, and Huerta said, look, can we just fire a salute to each other's flags and, call it even? Wilson said that's not good enough, and he ordered the U.S. Marines to invade Veracruz. And I have to think that this is one of the flimsiest excuses for war ever. And in case you're thinking I'm making this up, here's a newspaper headline from the day. Huerta must salute or Atlantic fleet will seize Tampico and Veracruz. Super dreadnoughts sail for Tampico to enforce the demand. 80 American soldiers refused to take part in the invasion of Veracruz, not because they were cowards. They could see how absurd this situation was. So they were tried for insubordination and thrown in the brig. What was really behind the invasion of Veracruz? Well, if you wanted to know, you could ask red pill guy like this gentleman, who I know many of you know, Smedley Butler. At the time of his death in 1940, he was the most decorated Marine in the history of the Marine Corps. So no one can say he was a wuss or a commie or unpatriotic. He was given a medal for taking part in the Veracruz invasion, and he refused to wear it because he knew what was really going on. In 1933, he went on a tour, giving a speech called War is a Racket, which he later turned into a book by the same name. And here's what he said. I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service as a member of the Marine Corps. I served in all commissioned ranks from second lieutenant to major general. And during that period, I spent most of my time being a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and for the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico, especially Tampico, safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the national Citibank boys to collect revenues, and that's a reference, of course, to the Spanish-American War. So what this war was about was oil. The kingpin of the American establishment at that time was John D. Rockefeller, the head of Standard Oil. It's not about Wilson, it's about Rockefeller. He's the one who's calling the shots. And Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company was plundering oil out of Mexico, and he didn't want to pay high taxes to the Mexican government. But President Huerta was very unfriendly to Standard Oil, so he had to go. This was a classic regime change war, just like we see today. After the Marines invaded Veracruz, the United States began shipping armaments to Huerta's rival for power named Carranza. Carranza then became president, Huerta was forced out, and American oil investments over the next 5 years more than doubled. By the way, Huerta was imprisoned here in the United States and very rapidly died of cirrhosis of the liver. The reason I put it in quotes is because there was widespread belief that he had been poisoned. Bringing up to World War I, which overshadowed the invasion of Veracruz, that's one reason we don't remember it. World War I started in 1914, and oligarchs on both sides of the Atlantic wanted America involved. But what was America's interest in this war? I mean, this was a European war, right? So the incident that got us into the war was the sinking of the Lusitania. This occurred on May the 7th, 1915. At the time, Britain was at war with Germany, but we were not yet involved in the war. It was a British passenger ship on its way from New York to England, and sunk off the southern coast of Ireland by a German U-boat. 1,200 on board died, including 128 Americans. And then there was a stream of propaganda, avenge the Lusitania, take up the sword of justice. When you file, remember this, enlist in the Navy. And new atrocity stories were invented about the Germans. For example, the public was told that the Germans were cutting the hands off children in Belgium. This was a widespread story at the time. But after the war, journalists went over to Belgium. They found there was nobody who'd ever witnessed such a thing. And do you remember during the Spanish-American War, there's a picture of the Brute? Well, guess who the Brute is now? Now the Brute has become Germany. He's the ape. He's got the Kaiser's helmet on. He's hanging onto a damsel in distress. He's got a bloody club and encourages you to enlist. And in 1915, the same year that the Lusitania sank, Hollywood released this movie, The Battle Cry of Peace, which showed an army of Huns invading America, and here they are molesting the virtuous maidens of New York City. The truth is, though, that the German fleet never even left the North Sea during the entire course of World War I. They were boxed in by the Royal Navy, which was superior. The only ships that got through the blockade were their U-boats. There was no chance or intention on their part to invade America. But why did the Germans sink the Lusitania? Well, a guy who was red-pilled on this matter was a guy I really admire, Senator Bob La Follette. He's a guy who really stood for the people. In fact, I like to call him the Ron Paul of his day. And here's what he said in a speech, quote, 4 days before the Lusitania sailed, President Wilson was warned in person by the Secretary of State Bryan that the Lusitania had 6 million rounds of ammunition on board besides explosives, and that passengers who proposed to sail on that vessel were sailing in a violation of the statute of this country that no passengers shall travel upon a railroad train or sail upon a vessel that carries dangerous explosives, end quote. Well, the oligarchs in America were so outraged at La Follette for making this revelation, they tried to have him expelled from the U.S. Congress, and proceedings were underway for that. But then former Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan came forward and corroborated everything that La Follette had said, which caused the proceedings to be called off. William Jennings Bryan, by the way, had resigned as Secretary of State because of the Wilson administration's relentless campaign to get us into the war. What was on the Lusitania that the Germans didn't want to reach England? 173 tons of Remington rifle cartridges, 50 tons of shrapnel shells, 46 tons of aluminum hydroxide, a powerful explosive used by the British military, 18 cases of mercury fulminate, another powerful military explosive, and unnumbered tons of gun cotton. I say unnumbered because the British disguised it on the manifest, but it was seen being loaded on the ship, and estimates are that it would have been over 100 tons. By the way, this is why the Lusitania went down after being hit by just one torpedo. You know, when the Lusitania was launched, it was the largest ship afloat at that time, 1906. Normally it would have taken several torpedoes, but the torpedo from the U-20, which sank the Lusitania, by the way, these World War I torpedoes were quite small compared to World War II ones. It hit the ship, and it went down in just 18 minutes. All survivors said there were two explosions, a small explosion followed by a huge one. The small explosion, of course, was the torpedo hitting, and the huge one was the munitions detonating. See, the Lusitania had been doing this on a regular basis. This wasn't the first time. It had made several trips from New York to England carrying munitions, using women and children as a protective shield. But the Germans had to stop it because they couldn't let these munitions kill their soldiers on the front in Europe. But even more damning is evidence that there was foreknowledge that the Lusitania was going to be sunk. Now, this man was our ambassador to England, Walter Hines Page. And believe it or not, while he was on public salary as our ambassador, he was also getting a private salary, a stipend, if you will, of $25,000 a year from the munitions manufacturer of Cleveland Dodge. Go figure, that's over $500,000 in today's dollars. But he wrote a letter to his son 5 days before the Lusitania was sunk, and here's what he wrote. You'll find this as an official life in letters. Quote, "If a British liner full of American passengers be blown up, what will Uncle Sam do? That's what's going to happen." Now, a lot of you people know that Woodrow Wilson had a handler. His name was Edward Mandell House. He had no official cabinet position, but he lived right in the White House, representing Wall Street, as Mark Hayne had done with McKinley. At the time that the Lusitania went down, he was in England, of all places. And the morning that the Lusitania was sunk, he met with the British Foreign Minister, Edward Grey. And here's what Edward Mandell House wrote, and you can find this in his official biography. He said, quote, "We spoke of the probability of an ocean liner being sunk, and I told him if this were done, a flame of indignation would sweep across America, which would in itself probably carry us into the war." That same day, House and Grey traveled over to Buckingham Palace and met with King George V. And here's what House wrote about that meeting. He said, quote, "We fell to talking, strangely enough, of the probability of Germany sinking a transatlantic liner. He," meaning the king, said, "Suppose they should sink the Lusitania with American passengers on board." And about 2 hours later, the Lusitania was sunk. Now you might be wondering, how could they know where to send a passenger liner into the path of a U-boat? How could they do that? Well, for one thing, Britain had cracked Germany's naval codes, so all the radio messages from Germany to the U-boat fleet were intercepted. On top of that, they sent the Lusitania right into an area where the U-20 had sunk 2 steamers the previous day. Now, normally when the Lusitania came to England from America, destroyers would protectively accompany her. But in this case, the destroyers were held back, even though there were 4 destroyers sitting idle in the nearby port of Milford Haven. This gentleman here is Patrick Beesley, considered the greatest authority in the history of British naval intelligence, in which he was a long-term officer. And here's what he wrote in his book, Room 40. Quote, "Nothing, absolutely nothing, was done to ensure the liner's safe arrival. I am reluctantly driven to the conclusion that there was a conspiracy deliberately to put the Lusitania at risk in the hopes that even an abortive attack on her would bring the United States into the war. Such a conspiracy could not have been put into effect without Winston Churchill's express permission and approval," end quote. Winston Churchill, by the way, the head of the British Admiralty at that time. All right, let's bring it up to World War II. And what was the event that brought us into that war? Of course, it was the attack on Pearl Harbor, when Japanese planes from aircraft carriers attacked the Pacific Fleet. They sank 18 ships, including 8 battleships, or at least heavily damaged them, if not fully sunk, and left over 2,000 Americans dead. I'm going to give it some extra attention to Pearl Harbor because that's a big one to unravel. I'm going to give you a couple of quotes that might shock some people. This first one is from Russell Grenfell, British historian and former captain in the Royal Navy. Here's what he wrote in 1952. Quote, "No reasonably informed person can now believe that Japan made a villainous, unexpected attack on the United States. An attack was not only fully expected, but was actually desired. It is beyond doubt that President Roosevelt wanted to get his country into war, but for political reasons was most anxious to ensure that the first act of hostility came from the other side, for which reason he caused increasing pressure to be by the Japanese, to a point that no self-respecting nation could endure without resort to arms. Japan was meant by the American president to attack the United States. This man is Oliver Littleton. He was Britain's Minister of Production. And here's what he said to the American Chamber of Congress in London, June the 20th, 1944. America provoked Japan to such an extent that the Japanese were forced to attack Pearl Harbor. It is a travesty in history ever to say that America was forced into war. So why did the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor? You know, yes, most people, they can't answer it. Well, here's a kick in the pants. When the Maine went down, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy was Teddy Roosevelt, very pro-war. And as you may know, during the Spanish-American War, became head of the Rough Riders. When the war was over, by November of 1898, he was already governor of New York. And by 1901, he was president of the United States. Now, when the Lusitania went down, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy was his cousin, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who then became governor of New York and then president of the United States. And the head of the British Admiralty when the Lusitania went down, as I've already mentioned, was Winston Churchill, who was also a cousin of Franklin D. Roosevelt, which makes it a little bit creepy when Pearl Harbor is approaching. And now these two men are heads of state. They are prime minister and president, respectively. Now, Roosevelt and Churchill figured that it's going to be easy to get America into World War II, just like they did in World War I. It's going to be real easy. All we need is another Lusitania, get the Germans to sink an American ship, and it's going to be easy. And so American ships were assigned to escort British convoys, war convoys, but the Germans didn't give them any satisfactions. The Germans knew that America coming into World War I turned the tide of the war against them, and they weren't going to let it happen again. And here's what Karl Dönitz, who was the commander of Germany's U-boat fleet, said during the Nuremberg trials. He said, quote, "A 300-mile safety zone was granted to America by Germany when international law called for only a 3-mile zone. I suggested minefields at Halifax and around Iceland, but the Fuhrer rejected this because he wanted to avoid conflict with the United States. When American destroyers in the summer of 1941 were ordered to attack German submarines, I was forbidden to fight back. I was thus forced not to attack British destroyers for fear there would be some mistake," end quote. So the attention turned to Japan. And Harold Ikes, our Secretary of the Interior, said this in 1941, "For a long time, I have believed that our best entry into the war would be by way of Japan." The attention shifted to Japan. And our Secretary of War at that time was Henry Stimson, Skull and Bones, for those of you who might be interested. In the fall of 1941, after cabinet meetings with the president, here's what he wrote in his diary. "We face the delicate question of the diplomatic fencing to be done so as to be sure that Japan is put into the wrong and makes the first bad move, overt move. The question was how we should maneuver them, the Japanese, into the position of firing the first shot." Now, this guy is Lieutenant Commander Arthur McCollum of U.S. Naval Intelligence, and he wrote up an 8-step plan of provocation to provoke Japan to war. Here are the closing words of that document. Quote, "Completely embargo all U.S. trade with Japan in collaboration with a similar embargo imposed by the British Empire. If by these means Japan could be led to commit an overt act of war, so much the better." Then in a memorandum to the President, Harold Ikes wrote, "There will never be so good a time to stop the shipment of oil to Japan as we now have. There might develop from embargoing of oil such a situation as would make it not only possible but easy to get into this war." So the date is significant, by the way, June the 23rd. That's the day after Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, began. Japan was very dependent on imports. They needed imports for 88% of their oil, 75% of their food, and many of their natural resources. So why did the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor? Well, they were being strangled by this embargo. Now, the official explanation for the embargo was that Japan was an aggressor nation, and the main proof of this was that they'd sent their troops into China. But what Roosevelt left out and what history books leave out is that Japanese sending troops into China was a reaction to the USSR, the Soviet Union, seizing Outer Mongolia and the province of China, Xinjiang. Now, this man here, Anthony Kubik, was the chairman of the history department at the University of Dallas. Here's what he wrote in an excellent book, How the Far East Was Lost. Quote, "It was apparent to Japanese statesmen that unless bastions of defense were built in Manchuria and the Inner Mongolia, communism would spread through all of North China and seriously threaten the security of Japan. The Department of State seemed not to regard Japan as a bulwark against Soviet expansion in North China. As a matter of fact, not one word of protest was sent by the Department of State to the Soviet Union, despite our absorption of Xinjiang and Outer Mongolia, while at the same time, Japan was censured for stationing troops in China. And I just wanted to mention something now. This double standard held throughout World War II. You might recall that World War II officially began in September of 1939 when German troops moved into Poland. But that very same month, September of 1939, Stalin and the Soviet Union invaded Poland. Well, when Germany did it, France and England declared war. When Russia did it, it was no notice whatsoever. The Japanese, from their perspective, they're across from the two big countries, the Soviet Union and China. Soviet Union was now communist. If China became communist as well, they realized that they'd be faced by communism everywhere and they would be destroyed by it. And their fears were well-founded because, as some of you know, by 1949, China did become communist. The Japanese were correct in their predictions. So what was the final trigger for that attack on Pearl Harbor? Well, the Japanese envoys in Washington were earnestly negotiating, trying to get this trade embargo lifted. And they said, here's what we'll do. We'll pull all of our troops, overseas troops, back into Japan, all of them in Southeast Asia, South China, but we have to maintain a small foothold on North China for our own national defense. But this was rejected, and an ultimatum was sent to Japan. It was authored by Harry Dexter White, who, guess what, he was a Soviet agent inside our government. And who says he was a Soviet agent? It's mainstream now. It was acknowledged by Herbert Brownell, who was Dwight Eisenhower's Attorney General. It was in Life magazine's article on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 2012, that he was indeed a Soviet spy, as well as authoring this ultimatum. The Japanese looked at this ultimatum and said, okay, you've given a choice. We can die by starvation or die by communism. That's death either way. You've backed us into a corner. We have to fight. And that's what led to the attack on Pearl Harbor after that ultimatum was seen. To get the Japanese to attack, you got to give them a tempting target. So you ever wonder this? What was the Pacific Fleet doing in Pearl Harbor in the first place? Normally it was always berthed in the West Coast around San Diego. The man who made the decision was President Roosevelt. Now, this is the fleet commander at the time, Admiral J.O. Richardson. He was so outraged by Roosevelt's decision that he flew to Washington to talk to the president to protest this. And he gave the president a whole list of reasons why the fleet should not be in Pearl Harbor. Number one, in Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, you're surrounded by 360 degrees of ocean. You're vulnerable to surprise attack from 360 degrees. Wouldn't be true if you kept it on the west coast of America. Also in Pearl Harbor, our ships were boxed in like sardines. So if a bomb missed one ship, it might hit the ship next to it. Ideal targets for bombers. In addition to that, we had to resupply the fleet over 2,000 miles of Pacific. Separating the entire Pacific Fleet from their families would be bad for morale, and he just went on and on. Well, when he was done, Roosevelt said only could give him one reason for putting the fleet in Pearl Harbor. He said it will deter Japanese aggression. Well, guess what? As of December the 7th, 1941, everyone knew it did not deter Japanese aggression. But historians have never held Roosevelt accountable for his decision. Instead, all the blame was put on the military. Our commanders in Hawaii were held accountable, General Walter C. Short and Admiral Husband Kimmel. By the way, Admiral Richardson had been removed from the scene after protesting moving the fleet to Pearl Harbor. He was fired by President Roosevelt. And finally, foreknowledge of the attack. Now, before anyone says there couldn't possibly be foreknowledge of the attack, our government would never let that happen to us. They'd never do that to us. You first need to familiarize yourself with these books. Pearl Harbor, The Story of the Secret War, published in 1947 by George Morgenstern, reported for the Chicago Tribune. The Final Secret of Pearl Harbor, subtitled The Washington Contribution, published in 1954 by Rear Admiral Robert Theobald, who was in Pearl Harbor on the day of attack, commanding destroyers. Admiral Kimmel's story, written by the Pacific Fleet Commander, published in 1955. Infamy by John Toland, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian. The BBC documentary Pearl Harbor, made in 1989. Day of Deceit, published in 2000 by Robert Stinnett, which further updated, brought us more information through the Freedom of Information Act. And if you don't believe any of those sources, guess what? Even the U.S. government said the U.S. government knew about the attack on Pearl Harbor. So what am I talking about? Well, in 1944, the Army and Navy conducted their own investigations of Pearl Harbor. And this is the Navy Court of Inquiry. And when they heard the evidence that Washington knew about the attack, the admirals flung their pencils on the floor. They completely exonerated Admiral Kimmel and laid all blame on Washington. And the Army Pearl Harbor Board, 1944, reached the same conclusion. These are the closing words of their report. Quote, up to the morning of December the 7th, 1941, everything that the Japanese were planning to do was known to the United States. So you might be wondering, how come the public didn't react with outrage to these reports? Well, the reason is because President Roosevelt and his administration ordered that they be classified and held top secret. So the public never found out, but you can read them online today. Roosevelt held them as top secret on grounds of national security, meaning his own security. How did Washington know about these attacks, by the way? Well, Japan communicated to all its embassies and consulates through something called the Purple Code, which the Japanese thought was so complex no one could translate it. But we had very talented cryptanalysts in America, and they did crack that code in 1940. So in 1941, we had these machines that would actually spit out Japanese messages, and were reading intercepts of the messages on a same-day basis. And copies of these went to just a few select individuals in Washington, and included President Roosevelt, and it also included this man, who's many considered to be Roosevelt's handler, is Harry Hopkins. He represented Wall Street. He had no official cabinet position, but he lived right in the White House, and he got to see these decoded intercepts, which means that certain people on Wall Street were also seeing them, but our commanders in Hawaii did not. Now, what did these intercepts reveal? They revealed that Japan had ordered its spies in Hawaii to identify the exact location of every American ship and dock. Now, there's nothing unusual about spies watching ship movements, but when spies are told to report the exact location of ships and dock, the implication is that they have been targeted for attack. But this information was not deemed significant enough by Washington to pass on to our commanders in Hawaii. Now, these are Japan's envoys meeting with our Secretary of State, Cordell Hull. If you've ever seen the movie Tora, 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 they give them their message-breaking relations, declaring war, and Hull reacts with shock and surprise. Oh, he's stunned. We're actually at war. Who knew, right? But actually, he'd read the declaration of war the day before that, the intercept of it, in his own office, as President Roosevelt, 13 parts of that 14-part message. So there was no surprise at all. But again, no warning was sent to Pearl Harbor. Now, the Roosevelt administration also received personal warnings about the attack from Joseph Grew, our ambassador to Japan, from J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, who was acting on information from a spy named Dusko Popov, from Brigadier General Elliot Thorpe, who was the U.S. military observer in Java, then under control of the Dutch. The Dutch learned of the Pearl Harbor attack, and General Thorpe sent a total of 4 warnings about Pearl Harbor to Washington until finally he was told, send no more warnings. And you can see Popov and Thorpe interviewed in that BBC documentary, Sacrifice of Pearl Harbor. Colonel F.G.L. Weigeman, the Dutch military attaché in Washington, personally warned our chief of staff about the attack, and Senator Guy Gillette and Congressman Martin Dies received information about the attack, personally passed that information to President Roosevelt, who told them just to leave it in his hands and not to pass that information along to anyone else. And finally, with the book Day of Deceit, it was revealed through the Freedom of Information Act, we'd not only broken Japan's diplomatic codes, but the naval codes at all, and were deciphering messages such as this one. Admiral Yamamoto to Japanese First Air Fleet, November the 26th, 1941. The task force, keeping its movement strictly secret and maintaining close guard against submarines and aircraft, shall advance into Hawaiian waters, and upon the very opening of hostilities shall attack the main force of the United States fleet and deal it a mortal blow. The first air raid is planned for the dawn of X day, exact date to be given by later order, end quote. And no one could read that message and not understand its significance. So bringing it up to Korea, which we'll deal with much more briefly. Korean War began in June of 1950 when Kim Il-sung, the communist dictator of North Korea, ordered the South to be invaded. Did you ever wonder this, though? How did Kim Il-sung come to power in North Korea? Now, this guy was a communist, but Red China, which is right behind Korea, it didn't become communist until 1949. So what's he doing running a communist running North Korea in 1945? Well, once again, American diplomacy made it happen. In 1944, Foreign Affairs, the Journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR, published an article called Korea in the Post-War World. And it suggested that Korea, which had been a colony of Japan, could be divided up after the war into a trusteeship to be occupied by the victorious allies, including Russia. And Harry Hopkins flew to Russia to meet with Stalin, and they worked out that deal. But what's the Soviet Union doing down in Asia? I mean, they weren't involved in the Pacific War at all. They had a non-aggression pact going with Japan during the war. But at the big 3 conferences of Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, Roosevelt asked Stalin, would you be willing to break your non-aggression pact with the Japanese? And Stalin said, you know, I'll do that, but only on one condition. The United States has to supply me with all the weapons, vehicles, and material that my Far Eastern Army will need for that expedition. And Roosevelt agreed, and at U.S. taxpayer expense, 600 shiploads of Lend-Lease were sent to Stalin to equip his army to fight Japan. But you know, Stalin was a very clever dude. He waited until the war was almost over. His troops come down into China to fight the Japanese. But he didn't do this until 5 days before the war was over, officially. The atomic bomb had already pounded Japan. Japan was suing for surrender, but here come the Russian forces down, and then for 5 days participation in the war, he was rewarded by being made the trustee of North Korea. And he put Kim Il-sung in power, and he established a powerful army under Kim Il-sung, 150,000 men, hundreds of tanks. You know, those Russian tanks were really good back then. Hundreds of warplanes, heavy artillery. But when the United States occupied South Korea in 1949, we left them nothing. No warplanes, no tanks. They didn't have one anti-tank gun. This was a total recipe for war. It was a setup. January the 1st, 1950, Kim Il-sung announced in a speech that this would be Korea's year of unification. He called for complete preparedness for war. What was the U.S. response to this? Well, there was a speech given at the American Press Club by the ever-intriguing Dean Acheson, our Secretary of State. You know, if you want to go deep state, it never gets deeper than Dean Acheson. All right, now, in this speech, he laid out America's defensive perimeter. It included Japan, but everybody noticed that South Korea was outside that defensive perimeter. And he said that if any country was attacked outside that perimeter, they would have to rely, quote, upon the commitments of the entire civilized world under the Charter of the United Nations. And that brings us up to the whole question of why did the oligarchs orchestrate the Korean War? You have to remember that out of World War I, you got the League of Nations, the first formal attempt at a world government. The United Nations came out of World War II, and that was entirely conceived at the Council on Foreign Relations. In fact, when the UN held its founding conference in San Francisco in 1945, 47 of the delegates were members of the CFR. Well, the Korean War was intended at that time to validate the UN as the world's peacekeeper. I'm going to quote the lead article from Foreign Affairs, April 1952, called Korea in Perspective, and here's what the author wrote. The burden of my argument, then, based on the meaning of our experience in Korea as I see it, is that we have made historic progress toward the establishment of a viable system of collective security. That's the UN. And there was one other reason for the Korean War, and that was to strip Congress of its constitutional authority to declare war. And since World War II, we've never had a declaration of war. President Truman sent troops to Korea without so much as consulting the Congress. He said he didn't have to. Why? Because we were under UN mandate. We'd signed the UN treaty, and we were subject to its call to join in a war. In his press conference of July 29, 1950, he actually said, quote, "We are not at war," end quote. Therefore, Congress has nothing to do with it. It was a, quote, police action, end quote. That's all it is. It's not a war. Well, over 40,000 U.S. soldiers died in Korea, and over 100,000 were wounded. But not to worry, it's not a war, just a little old police action. All right, let's take it up to Vietnam. Many of you guys know this. What was the resolution that brought about the escalation of that war? Yeah, there it is, the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. It was based on an alleged attack on U.S. destroyers on the night of August the 4th, 1964, in the Gulf of Tonkin off of Vietnam. President Johnson did not actually want to escalate the war. He was told to escalate the war by a secret clique of advisors called the Wise Men. These were 14 senior advisors, 12 of whom were members of the CFR. And if people don't believe that, they can read the book, The Wise Men, who was written by Isaacson and Thomas, who are themselves members of the CFR. The leader of the Wise Men, the man who was most vocal in demanding that Johnson escalate the war, was our old friend Dean Acheson. And who wrote the Tonkin Gulf Resolution? It was his son-in-law, William P. Bundy, skull and bones, in CFR. And did you know he wrote the Tonkin Gulf Resolution before the Tonkin Gulf incident took place? That was certainly good foresight. This man is Admiral James Stockdale. Let's discuss what really happened in Tonkin Gulf. Admiral Stockdale, recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor, was a pilot in the Tonkin Gulf at that time. He was later shot down, spent 7 years in a hellish communist POW camp, returned home, and he wrote this book, In Love and War, in which he described what really happened in Tonkin Gulf. And it just so happens I have a copy right here, so I am going to read from that book. I'm going to pick it up from his return to the aircraft carrier Ticonderoga after 1.5 hours of overflight of the scene of the alleged attack. Quote, "Wheeling into the ready room I had hurriedly left 3 hours before, I came face to face with about 10 assorted ship's company, air group, and staff intelligence officers, all with sheepish grins on their faces. The mood of the group was informal and mirthful. Obviously they had some big joke to tell me. What the hell's been going on out there? They laughingly asked. Damned if I know, I said. It's really a flap. The guy in the Maddox air control radio, the Maddox was one of the destroyers, was giving blow-by-blow accounts, turning left, turning right, torpedoes to the right of us, torpedoes to the left of us, boom, boom, boom. I got right down there and shot at whatever they were shooting at. I came around toward the destroyers once, right on the deck, chasing some imaginary PT boat they said was running up behind them, and fired every type of weapon I had, including a sidewinder. You see any boats? Not a one. No boats, no boat wakes, no ricochets off boats, no boat gunfire, no torpedo wakes, nothing but Black Sea and American firepower. For goodness sake, I must be going crazy. How could all that commotion have been built up out there without something being behind it? Now the next day, Stockdale was awoken by a young officer. Who are you, I asked. I'm the junior officer of the deck, sir. The captain sent me down to wake you. We just got a message from Washington telling us to prepare to launch strikes against the beach, sir. What's the idea of the strikes? Reprisal, sir. Reprisal for what? Last night's attack on the destroyers, sir. I flipped on my bed lamp and the young officer left. I felt like I'd been doused with ice water. How do I get in touch with the president? He's going off half-cocked. We were about to launch a war under false pretenses. I felt it was a bad portent that we seemed to be under the control of a mindless Washington bureaucracy, vain enough to pick their own legitimacies regardless of evidence, end quote. Admiral James Stockdale, recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor. Now we're going to move it up to 1985. In case anyone's wondering why I'm not mentioning the USS Liberty, 1967, my focus today is on false flags and deceptions that succeeded in bringing America into war, but I don't mean to downplay in any way the significance of USS Liberty. I have a blog post on it called Remember the Liberty. It's also in my book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior. All right, 1985, a big change happens. Mikhail Gorbachev comes to power in the Soviet Union, and he introduces glasnost, perestroika, and the Soviet Union liberalizes. He signs new friendship agreements with the United States. The Cold War effectively comes to an end. You know what should have happened? Our military budget should have gone way down with the Cold War over, but instead we went from the Cold War to the war on terror, and communism as the enemy was replaced by Islamic extremism, or alleged Islamic extremism, as the enemy. Also in 1985, this movie, famous movie, was released, Back to the Future. And remember those Libyans, those crazies, those whacked out guys who want Doc to build a nuclear bomb with plutonium? That kind of etched an image in your mind of what Libyans are like. The very next year, lo and behold, 1986, a bomb goes off in a German discotheque, La Belle Disco, which was frequented by U.S. servicemen. 2 servicemen were killed, dozens were wounded. And American intelligence picked up intercepts from Libya that made it appear that Libya was behind the incident. And so Ronald Reagan ordered U.S. planes to bomb Libya, and that was actually the first blow of the war on terror. But Americans didn't know one thing. We had been punked. This is Viktor Ostrovsky. He is a former officer in the Mossad, which is the Israeli CIA. And here's what he wrote in his book, The Other Side of Deception. A Trojan was a special communications device that could be planted by naval commandos deep inside enemy territory. The device would act as a relay station for misleading transmissions made by the disinformation unit in the Mossad called LAP and intended to be received by American and British listening stations. Originating from an IDF, Israeli Defense Force, Navy ship out at sea, the pre-recorded digital transmissions could be picked up only by the Trojan. The device would then rebroadcast the transmission on another frequency, the one used for official business in the enemy country. at which point the transmission would finally be picked up by American ears in Britain. The listeners would have no doubt they'd intercepted a genuine communication, hence the name Trojan, reminiscent of the mythical Trojan horse. He goes on to describe how the Mossad planted a Trojan in a Tripoli apartment. And continuing with his quote, using the Trojan, the Mossad tried to make it appear that a long series of terrorist orders were being transmitted to various Libyan embassies across the world. As the Mossad had hoped, the transmissions were deciphered by the Americans and construed as ample proof that the Libyans were active sponsors of terrorism. Heads of the Mossad were counting on the American promise to retaliate with vengeance against any country that could be proven to support terrorism. Ultimately, the Americans fell the Mossad ploy head over heels, dragging the British and the Germans somewhat reluctantly in with them. Operation Trojan was one of the Mossad's greatest successes. It brought about the airstrike on Libya that President Reagan had promised, end quote. Now, I just want to make a point. Sometimes if you mention information like this that puts Mossad or the State of Israel in a negative light, you get labeled anti-Semitic. So I just want to point out that my own family consisted of Russian Jews coming into this country in 1904. That is my great-grandfather, Abraham Perloff. That's my grandmother next to him. And the children are my father's older siblings. He was not born yet. But I want to make it clear, I am half Jewish. My father was Jewish. My mother was not. But for the record, I am 100% against racism in any form. Let's move up to the Gulf War of 1991. Now, I've been talking for a while now, so let's let somebody else do some talking. The Canadian journalist Barry Zwicker.
Fast forward again to August 2nd, 1990. Iraq attacks Kuwait, claiming the Kuwaitis are slant drilling into Iraq's oil fields. U.S. President George Herbert Walker Bush pushes for a land war against Iraq. But polls show the U.S. public is split 50-50 on that idea. Then comes this eyewitness testimony before a congressional committee from a 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl. The claim is she cannot be identified for fear of reprisals.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators, and left the children to die on the cold floor.
The U.S. public is outraged. The result? Support for land war zooms. It's a turning point. Desert Storm is launched. 135,000 Iraqis are killed. An estimated 1 million Iraqis, many of them children and old people, then die as a result of 10 years of sanctions. One small problem. There never were any incubator baby deaths, not one. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's investigative flagship program, The Fifth Estate, reveals the girl to be the Kuwaiti ambassador's daughter, given her lines and coached in acting by the giant American PR firm Hill & Knowlton. It's one phase in a $10 million joint U.S.-Kuwaiti campaign of deception. This man is lying.
I myself buried 14 newborn babies that had been taken from their incubators.
This man is lying.
And they had kids in incubators, and they were thrown out of the incubators so that Kuwait could be systematically dismantled.
There were a lot of people who participated in a conspiracy. Yes, an out-and-out conspiracy of fake organizations, false documents, fraud, and disinformation. So, if a new man named Bush is in the White House and helps engineer a brazen deception in order to achieve global geopolitical goals, as well as domestic and personal ones, it wouldn't be a first, would it?
So the tactics don't change. Remember, it was Cubans being thrown to sharks and in the Spanish-American War, and it was German soldiers cutting the hands of Belgian children. Atrocity stories will always convince the Americans to get into a war, it seems. This is, by the way, never to deny that real atrocities take place, but usually they're not the ones that the American mainstream media calls their attention to. Well, finally, the big one, 9/11. I know that a lot of people think that if you question the official story of 9/11, it means that you are a tinfoil hat conspiracy nut. Oh, this must be a meeting of Boston 9/11 Truth, right? No, this is Francesco Cossiga, former Prime Minister of Italy, former President of Italy, and he said this: however, all the democratic areas of America and of Europe, with the Italian center front in the forefront, now know full well that the disastrous attack was planned and executed by the American CIA and Mossad with the help of the Zionist world to falsely incriminate Arabic countries and to persuade the Western powers to invade in Iraq and Afghanistan, end quote. And you can find that quote right in his Wikipedia biography. Here's a native New Englander who is a former air traffic controller, Robin Horton, and he said this, quote, I knew within hours of the attacks on 9/11/2001 that it was an inside job. Based on my 11-year experience as an FAA air traffic controller in the busy Northeast corridor, I state unequivocally there was absolutely no way that 4 large commercial airliners could have flown around off course for 30 to 60 minutes on 9/11 without being intercepted and shot completely out of the sky by our jet fighters, unless very highly placed people in our government and our military wanted it to happen. I'm going to play part of a clip from Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, and this is from YouTube.
I'm Dr. Bob Bowman, Lieutenant Colonel, United States Air Force, retired. Flew 101 combat missions in Vietnam and directed all the DoD Star Wars programs under Presidents Ford and Carter. My PhD is in aeronautics and nuclear engineering from Caltech, and I did my postdoctoral work at the von Karman Institute in Brussels, Belgium, in finite element analysis. I taught at 5 colleges and universities, serving as department head and assistant dean. Finite element analysis is the solution of complex physical problems using advanced mathematics, things like turbulent flow or structural failure. I first became aware that there was a problem with the government's official conspiracy theory on 9/11 that very morning when I was watching what was happening on television, and my wife says I kept saying over and over, where are the interceptors? And then, of course, when the first of the towers actually started falling down, I just said, this can't happen. It can't happen. And then the other tower came down, and I said, this violates the laws of physics. It can't happen.
All right, let me stop that there. For people who doubt that credentialed people reject the official story of 9/11, I would encourage them to go to this website, patriotsquestion911.com, and you'll find hundreds and hundreds of statements by senior intelligence officials, military officials, law enforcement officials, government officials, engineers, architects, pilots who reject the official explanation of 9/11. I want to go back to a couple of things that Dr. Bob Bowman said. One is this violates the laws of physics. Now, when the Twin Towers were destroyed, there was nothing left except steel and dust. All the concrete, there were no chunks. It all turned to dust. Every piece of furniture turned to dust. Every toilet, every phone, every computer. There were about 10,000 metal filing cabinets in the World Trade Center, and they were all turned to dust except one, which survived, and it looked like a crumpled piece of aluminum foil. All the bodies were vaporized. You know, people would find, a finger bone here or a little piece of tissue there to do a DNA sample, but that was it. It's not possible to explain this as a simple rubble collapse, because there was no rubble. It's been estimated there should have been 12 stories of rubble, but it wasn't there. It all turned to dust. And if anyone thinks this is normal for a building collapse, I would just challenge them to find any other building in history that ever collapsed and everything inside became dust. It's never happened except on 9/11. And in case people were thinking, well, these are exceptionally tall buildings, so the tops would have pulverized the floors beneath them. Well, that still leaves us with the top floors. They should not have been pulverized. They should still have had rubble, as you would normally see in a collapse. Let's take a look at the North Tower exploding. And I want you to watch the plane holes there and notice that when the building, quote unquote, falls down, there's an enormous flash of flame.
That's great. Also, would you make reading some tape.
Other evidence of the buildings being demolished was the fact that steel pieces of the World Trade Center that weighed multiple tons were flung laterally. They went clocked as fast as 70 miles an hour, and some, like this one, embedded itself in the American Express building across the street. That won't happen with building collapse. Further proof of demolition comes from Building 7, which many of you, of course, are familiar with. This was part of the World Trade Center. It was the furthest building away from the Twin Towers, and later that day it perfectly collapsed. A 47-story building collapsing in 6.6 seconds. Now, the government's explanation for the Twin Towers was that they collapsed because of being hit by planes and then jet fuel melted or softened the steel. But you can't use that argument for Building 7 because it was never hit by a plane. Now, if you drop an object like a ball, laws of physics tell you that as the ball keeps dropping, it'll increase in speed. Well, scientists have actually measured the collapse of Building 7, and it actually increases in speed. In other words, nothing is holding it up at all. Now, the government tried to say that office fires caused the collapse, but many steel frame structures have had much bigger office fires and they didn't collapse. And if you want to try to argue that, okay, it was damaged by debris from the collapse of the Twin Towers, okay, maybe that would have affected the front facade of the building, but it would not have damaged the side or the back of the building, those columns, and there's no way it should have fallen into its own footprint. It was simply damaged in front, then you should have seen it collapse forward, not straight down into its own footprint, because asymmetrical damage does not cause a symmetrical collapse. Once you realize that the Twin Towers were demolished, you realize that that went way beyond the capacity of these guys. In fact, you think about it, in order to demolish the Twin Towers, the plane hits had to be guaranteed. And these guys couldn't guarantee that. So do you think that the architects of 9/11 planned it this way? Well, these 20-somethings that Osama bin Laden sent over, we hope that somehow they'll get into the locked cockpits. And if they do, we hope that somehow they'll take the controls away from the pilots, even though the pilots are bigger and most of them have military training. And then we hope that if they do get control of the planes, that even though none of them has ever been in a Boeing cockpit before, somehow they'll make perfect strikes. Because they did make perfect strikes. The width of the World Trade Center was 208 feet. The wingspan of a 767 is 156 feet. They really had to be accurate, and both planes just cocked their wings right before entry. You know, if you're a terrorist, you're about to face a fiery death. You're thinking about, let me get a perfect 10 on this hit. You know, I always want to, make sure this hit is perfect. It doesn't make sense. These planes hit with the accuracy of cruise missiles. I'm not saying, of course, that they were cruise missiles, but they hit with that type of accuracy, including the Pentagon. Now, I'm not going to play this clip, but I encourage you to go to YouTube and watch the video by pilots from 9/11 Truth called Airline Controllability. And they have an interview there with Dan Cavados, who is an FAA official, and he trains pilots. And after 9/11, he took 10 experienced jetliner pilots, and they said, guys, let's see if we can hit the Twin Towers. They couldn't do it. They got a simulator for a 737, which is much smaller and more maneuverable. They couldn't hit the Twin Towers. You know, the second plane, the one you always see hitting the South Tower, was going, according to the FAA, at 586 miles an hour. That is 172 miles above the maximum flying speed of a 767 at that altitude. And at that altitude, where the atmosphere is thicker, you have all kinds of forces, G-forces acting on the wings. It's very hard to control a plane at that altitude, at that speed. These pilots, these experienced Boeing pilots, who all had thousands of hours of experience flying jetliners, they all had to slow down to about landing speed, 180 to 200 miles per hour from 586 in order to hit the Twin Towers. So the idea that these amateurs who had never been in a Boeing cockpit in their lives could do it doesn't make a lot of sense. This is Hani Hanjour, who flew Flight 77 allegedly into the Pentagon. He wasn't allowed to rent a twin-engine Cessna because he couldn't control it at 75 miles per hour. He used to burst into tears during his flying lessons, and he couldn't even get a driver's license in this country for an automobile because his English was so poor on the written exam. Yet somehow we're supposed to believe that on 9/11 he became a super pilot. He hit the first floor of the Pentagon with such accuracy that he didn't even scuff the lawn. Now, somebody put this up on YouTube. It's a simulation of what Hanjo would have seen from the cockpit. Let's just play this. It's pretty short.
Too low, terrain. Too low, terrain. Too low, terrain. Too low, terrain. Too low, gear. Too low, terrain. Too low, gear. Too low, terrain. Too low, flaps. Too low, terrain. Pull up, terrain. Pull.
You know, 530 miles an hour is really fast. It's about almost 800 feet per second. So he's going 1,500 feet over the last 2 seconds. That's not much time under those conditions to give it this cruise missile accuracy that the plane had. Notice that the Pentagon is very hard to see. It doesn't come into view really until the last couple seconds, it seems, because it's flat. It's not tall like the World Trade Center. Well, the other question that Bob Bowman was asking was, where are the interceptors? A lot of protocols were violated in 9/11. It was standard procedure before 9/11 that if the air traffic controllers lost contact with it, if it turned off its transponder, they were supposed to immediately contact the military. That didn't happen for 18 minutes on 9/11. And of course, you recall that there were pilots sent from Cape Cod, from Otis Air Force Base. Actually, it would have been nice if they had sent some pilots from McGuire Air Force Base, which is in northern New Jersey. They could have headed off the planes. Of course, everyone is being caught by surprise. But what really raises question marks is the attack on the Pentagon. If we look at the timeline here, at 8:46, the North Tower was struck. CNN was really quick to respond. At 8:49, they already picked up the story. At 8:54, the hijacking of Flight 77, which hit the Pentagon, began. And at 9:03, the South Tower was struck. So at 9:03, we knew we were at war. We knew that the first plane was no accident. Flight 77 didn't hit the Pentagon until 35 minutes later. Now, Otis Air Force Base is only 10 miles from the Pentagon. And so the question is, why was this allowed to happen? Why was Flight 77 allowed to be hijacked and fly for 44 minutes without anybody coming in to intercept it? And in case you think that nobody knew that this plane was coming in, I'm sure many of you have seen this testimony of Norman Mineta before the 9/11 Commission.
I wanted to focus just a moment on the Presidential Emergency Operating Center. You were there for a good part of the day. I think you were there with the Vice President. And we had that order given, I think it was by the President, that authorized the shooting down of commercial aircraft that were suspected to be controlled by terrorists. Were you there when that order was given?
No, I was not. I was made aware of it during the time that the airplane coming in to the Pentagon. There was a young man who would come in and say to the Vice President, the plane is 50 miles out. The plane is 30 miles out. And when it got down to the plane is 10 miles out, the young man also said to the Vice President, do the orders still stand? And the Vice President turned and whipped his neck around and said, of course the orders still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary? Well, at the time I didn't know what all that meant. And
the flight you're referring to is the
flight that came into the Pentagon.
Yes.
Right. Now, we won't play the clips here, but we could also show clips of civilian air traffic control seeing the plane coming in. The head of the White House Secret Service, that they saw the plane coming in 50 miles out, 20 miles out. So the question is, where are the interceptors? Andrews Air Force Base did not respond to the World Trade Center attacks. It did not respond to the hijacking of Flight 77. It did not send up an interceptor until after the Pentagon had been hit, 10 miles from the Pentagon. If you would like to see a good video that refutes the official story of 9/11, I want to recommend this one, September 11th, the New Pearl Harbor, which can be watched on YouTube for free. So what was really going on 9/11? Well, Pat Buchanan, former advisor to presidents, and he was the Reform Party's presidential candidate, wrote this in his syndicated column in 2004. In 1996, in a strategy paper crafted for Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu, Richard Pearl, Douglas Feith, and David Wormser urged him to focus on removing Saddam Hussein from power as an Israeli strategic objective. Pearl, Feith, and Wormser were all on Bush's foreign policy team on 9/11. In 1998, 8 members of Bush's future team, including Pearl, Wolfowitz, and Rumsfeld, wrote President Clinton urging upon him a strategy that should aim above all at the removal of Saddam Hussein. On January the 1st, 2001, 9 months before 9/11, Wormser called for U.S.-Israeli attacks to broaden the Middle East conflict, to strike fatally the regimes of Damascus, that's Syria, Baghdad, that's Iraq, Tripoli, that is Libya, Tehran, which is Iran, and Gaza, to establish the recognition that fighting with either the United States or Israel is suicidal. Crises can be opportunities, added Wormser. On September the 11th, opportunity struck. Now, as many of you know, a number of these men, including Wolfowitz, Pearl, and Rumsfeld, as well as Dick Cheney, formed the Project for a New American Century, a think tank which produced this paper, Rebuilding America's Defenses, in September 2000, and it called for a increased U.S. military presence overseas, including the Middle East. But it said, the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. Then, in May 2001, Touchstone Pictures released Pearl Harbor. You know, I was actually assigned to review that movie by the New American Magazine when it came out. And but looking back, you know, I looked, and it seems that Touchstone Pictures had never produced a patriotic movie until that one. And then we had the real Pearl Harbor, right? Okay, so I want to play next a clip from General Wesley Clark, 3-star general who held many high positions, including Supreme Commander of NATO.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the joint staff who used to work for me, and one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They've just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
All right, so you might notice that the countries he's listed Pat Buchanan noted that these countries had already been targeted before 9/11. Now, after 9/11, they're immediately being targeted. But to have a war with a country, each war has to have a pretext. So what was the pretext for the war in Iraq? Of course, Colin Powell went to the UN, and he insisted very strongly that we were in danger from Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction. He said he had absolute proof of these. And actually, you know, even if Saddam Hussein had these weapons, do you think he'd be crazy enough to start a nuclear war with America? We could have turned Iraq into a total parking lot. And actually, Scott Ritter, the chief UN weapons inspector, had already said unequivocally that Iraq had no more weapons of mass destruction before the war started. And after the invasion, David Kay, the man on the right, said that, in his opinion, they had not had any weapons of mass destruction. Then Colin Powell, CRUZ, said his briefing before the UN had been based on faulty intelligence. And then you had President Bush making jokes like this.
Those weapons of mass destruction got to be somewhere. Nope, no weapons over there. Maybe under here.
Well, you know, it might have been funny to Bush, but it wasn't funny to the families who lost loved ones in Iraq, and it wasn't funny to the Iraqis. And we ended up we spent more than 10 years in that war and spent over $1 trillion for weapons of mass destruction that never existed. Now, how about the war in Afghanistan? Why did we start that one? Well, you may recall we went into Afghanistan because we demanded that they turn over bin Laden, and actually the Afghanis offered to cooperate. They said, if you can provide some evidence that Osama bin Laden wasn't behind his attacks, because bin Laden had denied it. And the United States refused to provide any evidence, and we simply invaded. And now that war has been going on. This is going to be 18 years this year. It's insane. His Washington Post saying Afghanistan war has gone on so long, people born after 9/11 can now enlist, actually recruiting people to fight in Afghanistan who were born after that war started. You know, World War II only took us 3.5 years to win, you know. Now, the whole reason we went in there was to get Osama bin Laden. According to the official story, he was killed in 2011, 8 years ago. And a lot of us didn't believe that story, by the way, because you know, it happened when Obama's pre-election ratings were at an all-time low. And of course, they said they immediately dumped his body in the ocean, which made it therefore impossible to corroborate. But actually, I tell you why I don't believe this bin Laden was really killed, because there he is. He was right in the Situation Room on the night there. Just kidding on that one. That one is Photoshopped. You know, the war in Afghanistan is costing us $45 billion a year, and in total it's cost us over $1 trillion, like the war in Iraq. Now, think what you could do with the $2 trillion from those two wars. You could pay off all the student debt in America. You could rebuild our infrastructure, fix the water in places like Flint, Michigan, right? How about the war on Libya? Libya was on that hit list that General Wesley Clark mentioned. And did you know that before we bombed Libya, the average per capita income there was $15,000 a year? Now, that's very high for the North African region, and this was a very stable state. But then in 2011, we bombed it. It's now in total chaos, and it now has one of the world's largest open slave markets, and which is one reason why Europe is being flooded with migrants from Libya. Another country on the hit list was Syria, and it was on the list. So Donald Trump now has launched cruise missile strikes twice on Syria, a country that's never attacked us. I wrote an article after the first cruise missile strike called 14 Reasons Why the Syria airstrikes were a really bad idea. I'm not going to give you all 14, but I'll mention a couple. The only proof in either case that Assad had used chemical weapons on his own people. The first case, they had selfies from the white helmets, which are Al-Qaeda. The Al-Nusra Front, Al-Qaeda, and the white helmets are all the same group. The white helmets are just their propaganda branch. And the second attack was from a now discredited video that they uploaded. Another reason is you can't dismantle chemical weapons by bombing them. It's a very careful, meticulous process. If you bomb chemical weapons, there's a strong chance they will actually spread into the atmosphere. And we drop bombs right into Damascus, the largest city in Syria. So what's really behind these Middle East wars? Because they don't make any sense. Remember before at the outset, though, I said that there's a plan to make Jerusalem the capital of the world government? If you go to Global Research, there's a really good article there called Greater Israel, the Zionist Plan for the Middle East, and it talks about the Oded-Yinon plan. And that is an internal policy of the Israeli government to destabilize and fragmentize all of their neighbors. If you're looking at a crime as a police detective, like 9/11 was a crime, usually when you look at a crime, one of the first questions you ask is, if you're looking at the guilty party, who benefited? Now, the Middle East Muslims didn't benefit from 9/11 because we bombed them into total chaos. America didn't benefit from 9/11 because we spent trillions on wars, we've lost thousands of soldiers' lives, and we've got an encroaching police state here in America. The only beneficiary was actually Israel, which has watched the U.S. military dismantle its enemies one by one. Now, this man here is Alan Zabrowski. He, like me, is partly of Jewish descent. He's a retired Marine officer, former director of studies at the United States Army War College's Strategic Studies Institute, a position he held for several years. And I'm giving you a quote from him. Quote, I've had long conversations over the last 2 weeks with contacts at the Army War College at the headquarters Marine Corps. And I've made it absolutely clear in both cases that it is 100% certain that 9/11 was a Mossad operation. And by the way, that's not an isolated quote. He said that many times. So what are these Mossad connections? Again, the Mossad is the Israeli intelligence service. Well, on 9/11, major news networks reported that a group of men had been spotted celebrating the attacks. They were photographing the Twin Towers. They were celebrating. They were high-fiving each other. They were filming themselves against the burning backdrop of the buildings. And they climbed into a van, and neighbors wrote down the license number, and they were caught by the police. This is all on CNN. But then the mainstream media just dropped the story. CNN never, to my knowledge, never said another word about it. Well, who were these men? They were actually Israelis. Two of them were Mossad, working for the Mossad. And one of them had a visitor's pass for the World Trade Center. They failed their lie detector tests. They already had their cameras set up at 8 o'clock in the morning when the planes were still on the runway at Logan. Nonetheless, after 2 weeks, the FBI halted their investigation of them. And after 2 months, they were allowed to go back to Israel along with dozens of other Israelis who'd been arrested in the wake of 9/11. Why was that? Because the man in charge of the 9/11 investigation for the Justice Department was Michael Chertoff, whose mother was a founding officer of Mossad. And Philip Zelikow, who headed the 9/11 Commission, is actually a dual Israeli citizen. Why in the world would somebody with citizenship in a foreign country be allowed to run the 9/11 Commission? Larry Silverstein took over ownership of the World Trade Center less than 2 months before the attacks. Now, he invested $124 million, and he got an insurance payout of over $4.5 billion. I think that's a very good return on a 2-month investment. Now, according to the New York Times, Silverstein always had breakfast every morning in the North Tower at the restaurant called Windows on the World. But wouldn't you know it, on 9/11, he had a lucky dermatologist appointment. Now, Silverstein was so close to Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu that Netanyahu called him every week, and I just want to quote the Israeli newspaper Haaretz on that. Quote, every Sunday afternoon, New York Times, Netanyahu would call Silverstein. It made no difference what the subject was or where Netanyahu was. He would always call up Haaretz, November 21st, 2001. Notice it's Netanyahu calling Silverstein, not the other way around. Now, security at all 3 involved airports on 9/11 was run by ICTS. ICTS, a private firm owned by Israelis. Now, the judge put in charge of handling litigation for the 9/11 victims' families was Alvin K. Hellerstein. Many of the families wanted to sue ICTS and sue the government. They wanted this thing to be handled in a courtroom. However, all of the families were forced to settle out of court by Judge Hellerstein. So he let ICTS off the hook, but his son worked in Israel as a lawyer for the company that represents ICTS, meaning Hellerstein had a clear conflict of interest. Only to scratch the surface here, but if you'd like to read more about this, I recommend Christopher Berlin's excellent book, Solving 9/11. And if you want to read something more quick, Wikispooks has an excellent post online called 9/11 Israel Did It. I'm going to close with one final clip. This is, let me just identify this guy. This is Patrick Clausen, Director of Research for the Washington Institute for Near Eastern Policy.
I think that crisis initiation is really tough. And it's very hard for me to see how the United States president can get us to war with Iran. Which leads me to conclude that if, in fact, compromise is not coming, that the traditional way of America gets to war is what would be best for U.S. interests. Some people might think that Mr. Roosevelt wanted to get us into World War II, as David mentioned. You may recall we had to wait for Pearl Harbor. Some people might think Mr. Wilson wanted to get us into World War I. You may recall he had to wait for the Lusitania episode. Some people might think that Mr. Johnson wanted to send troops to Vietnam. You may recall we had to wait for the Gulf of Tonkin episode. We didn't go to war with Spain until the until the Maine exploded. And may I point out that Mr. Lincoln did not feel he could call out the Federal Army until Fort Sumter was attacked, which is why he ordered the commander at Fort Sumter to do exactly that thing which the South Carolinians had said would cause an attack. So if, in fact, the Iranians aren't going to compromise, it would be best if somebody else started the war. One can combine other means of pressure with sanctions. I mentioned that explosion on August 17th. We could step up the pressure. I mean, look, people, Iranian submarines periodically go down. Someday one of them might not come up. Who would know why? We can do a variety of things if we wish to increase the pressure. I'm not advocating that, but I'm just suggesting that this is not a either-or proposition of, you know, it's just sanctions has to succeed or other things. We are in the game of using covert means against the Iranians. We could get nastier at that.
All right. So you may have noticed that this guy is saying the same thing I've been saying all through this talk, except that he digs this stuff and he thinks we should use the same type of measures to start a war with Iran, which you may recall was the last country on the hit list that General Wesley Clark mentioned. Well, you know, the oligarchs are into a lot more than just war. They're into everything from population control to central banking, and I've written a couple of books. I wrote a book in 2013 called Truth is a Lonely Warrior, which is a primer on this whole New World Order, A to Z. I just released this month a new book called 13 Pieces of the Jigsaw. Blog posts I've written since then, some of the more significant ones that fill in some of the holes, expands upon many of the details that we've talked about today. So anyway, that completes my presentation. I want to thank Boston 9/11 Truth for hosting this event. You can find more information on our website, jamesperloff.com. That does complete the presentation, and I know that Mike Carey is going to lead any questions or comments that people may have.
There are going to be indictments. There's going to be grand juries. John Brennan isn't going to need one lawyer. He's going to need 5.